folks. We're just gonna wait another extra couple of seconds and let people join. A minute. All right, let's get started. Well, welcome everybody from the Stockholm Waterfront Conference Center. I'm sorry you're not all able to join us here in the room, but thank you for joining us here online today. We're really excited about this particular session and appreciate that you've taken the time to kind of join us here as we talk about the importance of lead in drinking water. I thought I'd kick off by providing a little bit of background about how we got here and why we're having this kind of a session. In 2019, the University of North Carolina had concluded a water quality survey of 14 countries across the world. It still stands today as one of the largest water quality surveys of its kind. In 3 of those 14 countries, we were actually able to collect useful data on lead. And what we found across these 3 sub-Saharan African countries was that nearly 80% of the drinking water systems were contaminated with lead, and that nearly 1 of every 11 of these systems had lead levels that exceeded WHO values. And this occurred across system types, across locations, across any other variable that we saw. When we looked at these systems more carefully, what we found is that the sources of contamination were likely the lead-containing pipes and parts that were used in these systems that were then leaching lead into the drinking water. In other words, this is a problem that was wholly preventable if we had been using the right materials and safe materials in the construction of these systems. So this, as well as the work of many of our partners, many of us are with us here today, is what has led us, sorry for the pun, has led us here today with this presentation, to talk a little bit about the importance of lead in drinking water and some of the things that we can do to address these types of challenges. And so maybe to get us started, what we thought we would do is introduce Jennifer DeFront she's a technical officer at the World Health Organization. And then we'll go to Jorge Alvarez-Sela, the WASH specialist at UNICEF, to talk a little bit about the state of the evidence surrounding the health risks associated with lead exposure through drinking water. So maybe, Jennifer, we'll turn it over to you first.
Thanks so much, Aaron, and it's great to be here. So we heard already a little bit from you about why we should take some action on lead in water. And so as you pointed out, Jorge and I will elaborate on that. So when we're talking about health significance, we're looking at the toxicity, that is the health effects of lead, as well as exposure to lead, and then ultimately to public health impacts. So in this presentation, I'm going to expand on all 3 aspects of this. So lead, we know, is extremely toxic. It affects almost all body systems, from the kidneys to reproductive organs to cardiovascular system and neurological endpoints as well. All life stages are impacted, including the very vulnerable, that is children and developing fetuses. So we know that there is no health-based threshold for lead. So in other words, there is no safe level of lead exposure. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So I've talked a little bit about the health impacts of lead, so the toxicology, and now I want to talk a little bit about exposure. So there's widespread exposure to the population to lead, and this is evidenced by many studies. Here I just want to highlight one that UNICEF led, which shows that approximately 800 million children, that is 1 in 3 children, have blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. So why am I highlighting 5 micrograms per deciliter? This is an action level suggested by WHO, a level where there should be action taken to identify sources of lead exposure and to take action to mitigate exposure. Now, this map shows that exposure or elevated exposure is most extreme in lower middle income countries, but we do know that lead affects high income countries as well. And we've seen many news articles about this. And again, just to reiterate the point that no safe level of lead has been identified. So I've talked now about the toxicology health effects and exposure, and how does this translate into health impacts? So WHO has estimated, slide before, please. WHO has estimated that approximately 900 million people die each year as a result of lead exposure, and this is the lower end of the estimate. In addition, it causes significant disability. So it's estimated that 30% of the global burden of developmental intellectual disability of unknown origin is actually caused by lead exposure. Next slide, please. So with that as a backdrop, WHO has identified lead as one of 10 chemicals of major public health concern. This means that WHO urges countries to take action on lead, to identify sources of lead exposure, and to take action to reduce exposure from all lead sources. Next slide, please. So recognizing the importance of lead in water, WHO does include lead in its guidelines for drinking water quality. And WHO has included lead in the guidelines since the beginning, from 1958. This means that lead should be included in drinking water quality regulations, that there should be risk management to address lead, and that there should be water quality testing to verify that lead is not in water or is at low levels, and that management actions are taken. So next slide, please. With that, keep going. I'm going to turn it over to Jorge. So I mentioned lead in water. We've heard about the importance of that, but of course there's other sources of lead. And so turning it over to Jorge to continue.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm Jorge Alvarez Sala. I'm a WASH specialist at UNICEF. And I would like to explain a little bit how lead in water relates with other sources of lead poisoning. So as you can see in this slide, you can see that lead in water is one of the several sources of lead in entering into human bodies. Reducing any exposure of lead contributes to health protection efforts. At the moment, the scientific evidence shows that maybe lead in water is not the main factor for the very high levels of lead found in children all over the world. However, again, any contribution that reduces this concentration of lead in blood is a contribution to the health and well-being of children and adults all over the place. I would like to also mention that the lead sources might be different in very different locations. So in some cases, lead could be the main contributor. Water could be the main contributor to lead poisoning, whether in other locations could be other sources, as you can see in the slide. Next slide, please. Here you can see some examples of locations where lead in water has been a major issue identified, from Flint to even the University of North Carolina, who conducted a study and found that there were lead pipes and lead fixtures in the campus. So what we know at the moment, after a review of different literature and research studies, is that lead in water seems to be a problem that is much more common both in rural and urban areas, and both in the global north as well as in the global south, than previously known. So this is, again, is a contribution to a growing evidence that lead is definitely a toxic metal that we need to start paying much more attention in the water sector. Next slide. How big is the problem? Well, as I said, there is a growing evidence that lead in water is a problem. Unfortunately, we don't have all the answers to the multiple questions that you may have. What we know is that, again, is an issue in both low-income countries, high-income countries, rural urban areas. Aaron just mentioned the study at UNSC that helped bring additional evidence to this problem in small rural water supply systems in sub-Saharan Africa. But what we know now is that lead in water is not only geogenic, is not only limited to lead pipes, is also linked with quality of materials, as you can see in the next slide. Most lead comes from leaching, from lead-containing materials in water systems. It could come from pipes, it could come from fixtures, it could come from the taps. So monitoring and interpreting concentrations in drinking water is important. Lead is a chemical that requires specific protocols to do a proper measurement. And in terms of remedial actions, there are several options that are included in the WHO guideline that Jennifer presented earlier. There is definitely more practical guidance as well as more research to understand better the problem and the magnitude of the problem and the different responses that apply to each and every case. Next slide. So here you can see a practical guidance manual that was developed not long ago on how to manage lead in drinking water, focus on 3 important areas. The first one is prevention. We need to make sure that those materials that could potentially leak lead into water systems are no longer installed. We need to also focus on mitigation. And last but not least, we need to focus on remediation in cases where lead-containing materials exist in the water supply systems. With this slide, I think I will pass the floor to Aaron, back to Aaron. Thank you.
Sorry for all the shuffling around, but no, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Jorge. I mean, so, they've really laid out the case here that lead exposure from drinking water is a widespread challenge. It could be presenting a significant health risk for populations across the world, particularly for children. And that lead can come from either geogenic sources or primarily from what we're seeing, the component parts that are used in these systems that are now leaching lead into the drinking water. And that the general strategy to address these things is to focus on prevention, mitigation, and remediation. And so what this group and other partners who are very interested in addressing lead did was that we took an initiative to try to begin to build political will to address lead in drinking water. And you can go to the next slide, Christopher. And in 2023, oops, not quite that one. It should be the other. Okay, sorry. So in 2023, what we did is we launched a global initiative called Global Lead-Free Water. And we held an event up at the UN on the margins, the high-level UN Water Conference, to focus attention on actions governments and non-governmental partners can take to address lead in drinking water. We launched what was called the Lead Pledge, and the Lead Pledge was focused on a global commitment to eliminate the use of lead leaching pipes, parts, and components in the construction of new water systems by 2030, and to mitigate lead exposure from all drinking water systems by 2040. And we mobilized governments and non-governmental actors around this pledge and begin to develop a network of partners that could provide support to governments and other partners who are interested in addressing lead exposure in drinking water. And what we'd like to do over the rest of the period here is to talk a little bit about some of the approaches that these partners have developed to address some of these challenges that all of you might face in whatever context that you might be. And so we'll start with talking about one of the responses, which is to improve monitoring and evaluation. How do we know where the lead is so that we can begin to take action? And we'll have 3 speakers: Anna Murray, the Deputy Director of Research at the Aquia Institute, Jennifer Redmond, the Senior Director for Water Quality at RTI International, and then Mike Fisher, the Assistant Professor at the University of North Carolina. And we will talk about the importance of monitoring and evaluation, challenges and approaches, how you build the right capacity to do proper monitoring and evaluation, and what type of plans you have to have in place to be able to make that happen. And so, Anna, I'll turn it right over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Next slide, please. So one way, as Aaron says, to start responding to this issue about lead in drinking water is to lead with evidence. So it's often said that you can't manage what you can't measure. So in this section, we'll speak about how you can generate credible data and also communicate those results effectively, which could become a tool for advocacy. Next slide, please. So any water sampling and testing plan requires important procedural and quality control considerations. So there's things to consider about water sampling, laboratory testing and analysis, as well as risk communication and data interpretation. But we know that lead isn't like other water quality parameters that folks might be more accustomed to measuring. So things like E. coli or chlorine, lead behaves a little bit differently. So some of the challenges are, first, concentrations in water systems are known to vary in space and time. So as we've been talking about, many of the sources of the lead are the components themselves. And so, it also depends on the chemistry of the water, and those concentrations can change throughout the system. Second, we need to measure trace levels of lead, so very low concentrations, to ensure compliance with guidelines or standards, because again, as we've been speaking about, there is no safe level of lead, so we want to measure as close to zero as possible. And then finally, because we know about the health impacts of lead, the results really have to be treated with care. So water suppliers, water consumers should be informed in an appropriate manner about the risks and what mitigation options might be. So as you're thinking about embarking on a monitoring or surveillance effort, we really need to consider all of these things kind of holistically and be clear about what you're seeking to learn. What's the question you're trying to answer, or regulatory requirements that you're aiming to address, and make all those decisions about these different factors based on that. Next slide, please. So to get into a few of the specifics, first, determining a sampling strategy is particularly important for lead testing. So we know lead varies in space and time throughout a system, so you have to ensure that you're selecting a sampling plan that will give you the information that you're looking for. So things to consider are how many samples to collect, where to collect those samples, how long the water might be in contact with those components that we think might be introducing lead. So do you want to flush the system or take a sample right at the start? And the document that was mentioned earlier, the Lead in Water Technical Brief, has a lot of these sampling options and recommendations for various purposes of testing. So that's a good resource to start with if you're getting started in this type of work. Next slide, please. So the next thing to think about is laboratory testing and analysis. So again, we know there's no safe level of lead in drinking water, so we need to measure at very low concentrations. So this requires special equipment, skilled laboratory technicians, and really strict quality control procedures to make sure that we're actually able to quantify the amount of lead in drinking water. And again, that document that I just mentioned has also recommendations for analyzing samples, different test methods that can be used. It's a good resource. And with that, I'll pass it on to Mike Fisher, who will continue speaking about some considerations for laboratory and quality control.
Thanks very much, Anna. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Murray was mentioning, we have opportunities to generate credible data here when the right equipment and the right expertise are in place. Can you advance it one click, please? We need to use suitable instrumentation and methods, and a lot of these are described in the WHO technical brief. Next, advance, please. But we also need to ensure that we have proper calibrations. And we need to ensure that the quality control and quality assurance methods that we're using are suitable. One more click, please. At the beginning of this session, Jorge Alvarez Sala mentioned a 3-country study of lead in drinking water that we linked in the chat. What might not be known to a lot of folks is that that started out as a 10-country study. And we worked with 10 different partner laboratories in different countries, and only 3 of the 10 were able to generate credible data, despite the fact that most of those laboratories had suitable instrumentation and methods. And one of the things that became apparent is that having sensitive instrumentation, such as ICP-MS, isn't sufficient to generate credible data for solving problems around lead in drinking water. We need to have the right calibrations in place, the right documentation, and there are standard methods and procedures to ensure that these instruments, these personnel, and these methods can generate the credible data that we need. Those include data verification and validation, data quality assessment, and initial demonstrations of capability for the method in the context. But those things weren't in place in most of our laboratories. And so as a result, many very qualified laboratories, many of them with ISO 17025 certification and good instruments, weren't able to get the job done. They weren't able to provide credible data. And so one of the things that we're committed to doing through the Global Lead-Free-Water.org partnership and through the International Toxic Metal Working Group is pulling together some of the tools and materials that can be helpful to laboratories, countries, and decision makers to ensure that they are leveraging their equipment and their capability to generate credible data that can be used for solving problems. And so the globalleadfreewater.org site has a resources page, and over the coming months, we'll be pulling together available resources on that topic and working to start to develop some trainings and some other resources to synthesize and simplify what's out there to enable partners to leverage the instrumentation, the personnel, the know-how that they have to generate credible data, to demonstrate proficiency with appropriate calibrations, documentation, use of blanks, duplicates, and standard reference materials, quality assurance and quality control checks, so that the data that are generated, despite the challenges around monitoring lead in drinking water, will be fit for purpose of tackling the challenge, reducing exposure to lead in drinking water, and then tracking improvements over time. And as that's being done, it's essential to be able to communicate around risk, communicate around progress, and use credible data for decision making. And so Jenny Redmond from RTI International will talk a little bit more about that critical next step once we're able to generate credible data on the challenge.
Thanks, Michael. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to address participation and results interpretation concerns around monitoring and evaluation, specifically with the use of risk communication. Because the goal for lead exposure is 0, but lab detection limits vary above 0, along with guideline values, it's really important to thread the needle in messaging, both before, during, and after monitoring, also known as testing efforts. Before monitoring occurs, it's really critical to garner multi-sectoral support. And after monitoring, it's imperative to consider results and potential actions that can be taken. Next slide, please. A common misconception is, wouldn't utilities and well users know if lead was an issue in water without testing it at the point of consumption? The short answer is no. Lead is often present at the tap because of its use in existing piping, plumbing, fixtures, and solder, rather than the actual source water used. Older water infrastructure and drinking water systems in countries without regulations are also more likely to contain lead at the tap. Water chemistry can affect the likelihood of this, and levels can vary in drinking water across systems and even within buildings. Importantly, we cannot see, smell, or taste lead, but if we measure it, we can manage it, as Anna mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So now that we've overviewed the importance of actually conducting monitoring and evaluation, we will briefly overview strategies to garner multi-sectoral support to do testing. There's a lot of individuals that require buy-in, from water users to operators to government agencies. It's important to lead with the why. If every sector understands the importance of testing for lead in water, a monitoring and evaluation plan is more likely to be successfully implemented. To do so, develop a communication toolkit and identify where and when people and participants can engage in each area, and communicate about the entire process, from planning to testing and monitoring to taking action. Make it as easy as possible and standardize the process, but be sure to be inclusive to different needs and people and areas. Because multidisciplinary problems require multi-sectoral partnerships, this pre-work is really needed. Lastly, make sure one of the collaborating organizations is local or be the local organization. Next slide, please. Another myth is, if lead was detected, I don't know what we would do, especially with limited resources. This is an incorrect assumption, because if we find it, we can fix it. We can provide results with possible recommended actions, and there are no-cost and low-cost solutions to eliminate exposure to lead, even if the broader infrastructure improvements take more time and resources. If we find it, we can fix it. Next slide, please. So this is why communicating about results is a fundamental aspect of any monitoring and evaluation program. Before testing actually occurs and after, engage communities with contextualized results. Provide actionable advice, not just identified problems, and frame the risks, especially risk perception versus actual risk. If someone receives feedback that there isn't lead in their water, but they still think that it's of poor water quality because of the taste, for example, we have to address underlying beliefs and habits to improve understanding and support actionable changes. And now that we've overviewed the key aspects of monitoring and evaluation, Lindsay will overview the next section. You take it away, Erin.
No, go ahead, Lindsay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Lang, and I'm the Senior External Engagement Advisor for WASH at World Vision. At World Vision, we have more than 1,200 staff working on WASH programs in about 50 countries globally. And today I'm going to share a bit about some of the practical things we've done as an implementing organization in response to the lead issue. Next slide. Yep, thank you. The first thing we did was revise our supply chain and procurement guidelines for World Vision WASH staff and for suppliers. These documents outline various standards that must be followed by WASH World Vision staff and suppliers for the procurement and verification of WASH goods, materials, and services to ensure only certified lead-free water system components are used in future water projects. We also updated our water quality testing protocol, which provides uniform guidance to all World Vision WASH programs on water quality testing frequency, methodology, and parameters in alignment with WHO's guidelines for drinking water quality. We're currently developing infrastructure material standards to support our supply chain and procurement guidelines based on results from ongoing research in Ghana with the Water Institute at UNC. We're currently partnering on a multi-year research study to further understand the scope and causes of the lead problem in rural water supplies and to identify effective preventative and remediation measures. Our first standard was finalized recently, and it stipulates that our WASH programs should not be installing brass taps and should only be using certified lead-free taps in all water systems. So now when a new piped water system is completed, staff must enter the system into M-Water and include the certification that the taps are safe, details about the manufacturer, materials, lot numbers, etc., and a photo of the installed taps. Throughout this study, as more results become available, we'll be releasing new standards related to the procurement and installation of infrastructure materials, as well as instructions for our staff on how to incorporate the standard into their typical WASH programming. Next slide, please. At the same time, we've been working closely with our national and regional offices to ensure that our WASH teams are actually implementing these new guidelines and standards. We started the rollout by conducting trainings for our WASH procurement and audit teams globally. And then we've been monitoring their activities to ensure that the guidelines are being followed and to address any challenges that come up. We're also in the process of hiring WASH infrastructure quality assurance and quality control specialists for each region who will oversee compliance with World Vision standards and policies related to infrastructure design, material procurement, and construction, and will provide additional capacity building to WASH and procurement staff in their region. Finally, we're encouraging our national office WASH teams to work collaboratively with WHO, UNICEF, and WaterAid to advocate with their governments and partners to endorse and commit to the Global Lead Pledge. That's a bit about what World Vision has done over the past couple of years related to procurement and operations to reduce the presence of lead leaching materials in our water systems. Thanks for your time today. I'll hand things back to Aaron.
Thanks, Lindsay. That was great. It's great to hear some of the work that some of those implementing partners out in the field are taking and some of the steps that they can take to help prevent lead exposure outside in these rural communities. Huge appreciation for that. I'd now like to turn it over to Lauren Post-Thomas. She's a senior advocacy officer at the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, and she'll talk a little bit about how grant-making bodies and the steps that they can take to promote the use of safe components in the construction of new water supply systems. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. The Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, as part of our Safe Water Initiative and strategy, has recognized the health threat of lead exposure, especially when it comes to children's development, and that it can exacerbate inequalities in marginalized communities. And that's why we decided to sign on as a founding member of the Global Lead-Free Water Pledge last year at the UN Water Conference. And we're supporting the pledge and its goals in four major ways. First and foremost, we're putting governments in the lead to address this issue within their countries, with a focus on rural areas, which often get left behind. We're providing direct grants and are supporting technical assistance to the governments of Ghana and Uganda in particular to coordinate across their ministries, to identify ways they can bolster testing for and national regulations around lead in drinking water. And we're looking for more countries to work on with this as well. Second, we're supporting researchers and academics like UNC Water Institute and the Quiet Institute, which are at the cutting edge of testing and monitoring and identifying sources of lead in drinking water in low and middle income countries. And we hope over the next several years, we'll have much more evidence and better baselining for where lead in drinking water is a problem and the best practices for mitigating it. Third, we're working with industry partners like IATMO to address lead in water from a supply chain perspective. For example, reviewing and improving country standards and guidance for drinking water parts and pipes that could potentially leach lead into drinking water. And finally, we're working with our grantees, many of whom are implementing partners and NGOs to test for lead in any water quality monitoring that they're doing. And ensuring that they have the right standards in place to ensure that they don't use lead leaching parts in their projects. All in all, we're a really proud supporter of the work to eliminate lead in drinking water, and we look forward to working with other donors and partners, including those here today, to address this challenge. Thank you. Back to you, Aaron.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. It's, again, great to hear some of the actions that are happening among all of our partners out in the field. And it's just tremendous support in terms of helping and energizing everyone else around this type of an issue. I'm now going to turn it over to Dane Hansen. He's the Executive Vice President of Government Relations at IATMO. And he's going to talk a little bit about some of the steps that government and industry can take to formalize markets for water and sanitation products to improve the supply chains of lead-free components. So Dane, over to you.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As you can tell, we have a fantastic group and coalition behind this effort. And as we know, it takes a village in order to address these issues. Next slide. So what are we doing? What is the industry doing as a whole to try to make this issue go away once and for all? So we have partnered and done many studies across the country and recently with the federal government, U.S. federal government, to see where are there gaps in the products that are currently being regulated. And as you will note, there seems to be, major gaps within the various systems. So within fittings, piping, water filtration, you can see in the blue, piping is definitely one of the more regulated. And then from there, it kind of trails off pretty quick in different countries. But one of the things that we're finding, and the thing that we need to address is, even if you have great products, if they're not being regulated and enforced, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. You know, the products are there, they can help stem the issue and keep it from happening. But fundamentally, the thing we face is, if they're not getting in the system now, we're going to have the same problem in another 20, 30, 40 years. Because as you know, many of the systems that we're having the issues now were from components that have been installed 20, 30 years ago. So we are just going to perpetuate the problem unless we actually, as a coalition here, come together and figure out a way to do it. So as we know, it's very difficult to tell which products contain lead off the surface, which is, you know, it was great to hear from World Vision and other partners of what are they doing? What are they doing to require certified products? What are they doing to try to enforce the products that are coming in that are being utilized within the system, so they know that, hey, these are safe and reliable, and for the next 20, 30, 40 years, they're going to be fine, rather than, you know, installing products that may be coming in, counterfeit products from overseas that may not be legitimate, that are just going to cause more problems. So next slide. So as you can see, you know, we have a great coalition, as has been evident by this global lead-free partnership. So we, you know, kicked it off at UNC several years ago, and it's kind of started to kind of evolve and continue moving forward. It was launched again at the UN Water Conference, did an event there that Aaron referenced earlier in this session. And then last year in August of 2023, the US hosted APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, as many people may know, for this specific issue on reducing lead leaching system in the plumbing systems. So that was a great event held, and as you can see from the photo, we had a great representation from various economies that are very active and are making efforts to reduce lead in their systems. And continuing moving forward, we are, as a coalition, proposing further engagements. And just recently, we were approved to move forward in 2024, May of 2024. The US submitted a proposal for a similar, you know, 2-day summit at the next APEC meeting. The summit will be held in Korea in February of 2025. And this is going to be a 2-day summit to talk about, you know, how do you build better quality? How do you have better infrastructure? How do you address contamination in water, which also includes lead? So we're really excited, as you can see, you know, just in a few short years, what a coalition has done to address these systems and address everything moving forward. We're really excited to continue that. We're hoping that out of the APEC meetings that we will be able to have a report issued and a really strong roadmap that we will be able to issue on how we can all, you know, what we are talking about now can be perpetuated publicly in a roadmap that can address these systems globally. So thank you for your time.
Great, Dane. Thank you, Dane, both for updating us on some of the things that industry and governments can do to help prevent some of these exposures, as well as some of the other steps that are happening in the political sphere to, again, build that political will and get countries more engaged and involved in how we address these issues. We're now going to turn to Lillian Idruka. Did I pronounce it properly? Thank you. Commissioner of Water Quality at the Uganda Ministry of Water and the Environment. And she's going to talk a little bit about the steps that governments can take to promote lead-free water systems, including the development of national plans and strategies. And so, Lillian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Yes, I'll talk about the role of government from this perspective of Uganda. Uganda is one of the founding members to the Global Pledge to protect drinking water from lead. And as government, I think we can play our role along 4 different areas to stop the flow of lead in drinking water. We need good institutional and legal framework for our governments. We need strong institutions to be able to set the required policies and make lead-free drinking water as an integral part of the WASH programs we have in our countries. And we will also need to develop the required standards for both regulation of the materials that have been talked about We need to develop the quality of the materials required that are lead free. And for this, we need a strong government institutions. But as governments, we also need to take up our role in regulation of these materials. In Uganda, we have the standard bodies. We have the Uganda National Bureau of Standards that is responsible for regulation of materials that come into the country. And we have already started conversations with them to be able to stop the importation of materials that could be containing lead. And UNBS does this through what they call pre-shipment verification of conformity. And they have international agencies like SGS and Bureau Veritas they use. So we think if we develop the standards, then through this mechanism, UNBS should be able to stop the importation of materials that contain lead for our waters. But will also involve our tax bodies, because they are the ones that are responsible for control of the entry of these materials into the country. Now, government will also continue monitoring and evaluation because after the development of the standards, then we'll have to continue the monitoring and evaluation. Anna already talked about how challenging it is for the analysis of lead by the laboratories. We have the National Water Quality Reference Laboratory, and we are grateful that we've been able to start monitoring using funding from the Hilton Foundation. And we think all government institutions that are responsible for the supply of water should get involved in the monitoring and evaluation of lead in drinking water. But these institutions may need capacity development, considering that the analysis of lead is not just a challenging venture, but it's also an expensive one. It's very expensive. The equipment that have been talked about are not very cheap, and they are not found in all government institutions in Uganda. So lastly, for this to succeed, of course, we'll need the required partnerships. Partnerships to bring in the required resources, but partnerships also to help in capacity development of the relevant institutions in governments. I thank you. Hand over back to Ara. Thank you.
No, thank you, Lillian, for making those points. And it's a clear call to action. Very much appreciate the different elements that you raised about capacity building, the need for resources, the need for partnerships. And that's not just partnerships among the people on this call, but when you're addressing lead, you have to work closely with the communities themselves. And that's something that we really want to encourage and remind people that that's an important thing for folks to do. I'd also like to let people know that in a couple seconds, I'm going to turn it over to you and give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you'd like. At that point, I do encourage you to use the chat now. Write your questions into the chat if you'd like. We've got a few minutes for Q&A, and I think we can bring up almost any of the speakers. So if there's a specific speaker you'd like to address it to, just let us know. A couple of times, I don't know, do you want me to take quick control there? And I can share. Does that allow me to do that? Does this kick you off, or are you okay? Great. Several speakers mentioned this global call to action and what happened up in the United Nations. Do you see that, Christopher?
Can you share now?
It should be. Yep, just in theory, we're good. Okay, we're good to go. And so many of you mentioned this global call to action. globalleadfreewater.org. Just to remind people, this again was launched at the UN high-level UN conference. Again, many partners and governments came together to make this event happen. We were very pleased with the founding partners who really worked together to make this work. We did launch the global pledge to protect drinking water from lead. We've covered a lot of the elements about the things that we commit to do under that pledge, including removing lead-containing materials from the construction of these new systems and remediating and mitigating exposure from existing systems. And we also talked about a number of the specific actions that we have outlined that you can take in the pledge. I do refer people back to this site, globalleadfreewater.org, for those of you who are looking for more information on the lead challenge, different steps that you might be able to take to address these challenges within your own country or own situation or own stand, depending on who you are in that supply chain, so to speak. There are different steps that you can take. So I encourage everyone to go back to that site. So I'm going to pause here and open the floor up to any questions, either from the folks online or anybody in the chat, just for a quick second. And if not, then great. I'm going to hand it over to Sam Houston. Sam is the Division Chief of Water and Sanitation of Technical Services at USAID. And Sam's going to close it out for us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron. As mentioned, my name is Sam Houston. I represent the USAID Center for Water Security. In many of the low resource settings where USAID works, lead contamination from water systems is not sufficiently understood. It is time that we all better understand this issue and the magnitude of the problem that lead exposure presents in water systems. In these settings, as we've heard, there's typically higher risks from other sources such as spices, ceramic glaze, lead acid battery recycling. However, that does not mean that we do not have a problem in the water sector, which is why this has been a priority for this administration across all exposure types, both internationally and domestically. Under the U.S. Global Water Strategy, USAID prioritizes strengthening water governance and institutions to ensure that our local partners can sustain resilient, well-financed, and quality services. Through our governance partnerships, we invest in water quality regulations and other policies that ultimately can protect against lead exposure. Our work to strengthen water institutions and service providers enhances their ability to monitor and improve water quality and otherwise maintain important standards. Additionally, where we do support construction and/or rehabilitation of pipe systems or hand pumps, we are subject to U.S. law and regulations that safeguard against the use of lead pipes and fittings in our procurements. At the completion of construction, water quality testing is always required by Reg 216, and USAID and its partners are obligated to test water quality before use. Importantly, I'm pleased to provide an update that USAID is working on revising our basic water quality testing parameters, and that lead will be one of the new parameters required for testing. This change in requirements will ensure that our efforts to eliminate lead exposure will continue to be a priority for all USAID water investments. In closing, I want to extend a big thank you to our session organizers from UNC and IAPMO for convening this group of experts to elevate this important topic, which has been overlooked for far too long. And finally, I'd like to thank the audience for joining today's session and for your future engagement on this important issue. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you, Sam. This is Aaron Salzberg, Director of the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina, from the Stockholm Conference Center, the Waterfront Conference Center at World Water Week. And we were so excited all of you could join us today. So take care.